Good evening, everybody. My name is Gail Simmons. I am a new member of the Kalamazoo Area Wild Ones and the Executive Committee, and I am your new Zoom host for this evening. I'd like to welcome everybody to this evening's meeting and presentation. I'm looking forward myself very much to hearing what our speaker has to say about plants for pollinators. If you're a member of the Kalamazoo Area Chapter of Wild Ones or would like to become one, be sure to check out our website, kalamazoowildones.org, where you will also find links to other programs and activities, our Facebook page, our YouTube channel, and a sign up for our Seedlings newsletter if you're not already receiving it. For those of you who may be new to Wild Ones, we are a nonprofit membership organization dedicated to promoting native plants and natural and sustainable landscaping. If you are interested in becoming a member, please visit our chapter website at kalamazoowildones.org, where you'll find information about member benefits, programs and events, and helpful resources. We're always looking for enthusiastic volunteers to get involved. Our email address is info@kalamazoowildones.org. We hope to see you soon at an in-person event or webinar meeting. And in particular, coming up on June the 18th, we have our Wild Ones annual native plant sale. So please see our website for more information about that if you are interested. And now let me turn over the meeting to my fellow executive committee member, Ann Fraser, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Gail. It is my honor and my very great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Rebecca Tonietto. Rebecca and I go back a long way. I started teaching at Kalamazoo College in 2003. And Becky was one of my first students. And so I think maybe the very first entomology course I ever taught, that Becky was a student there. And, you know, it was a real pleasure to see her grow and just thrive as she went through college. And Becky left Kalamazoo College and immediately went and took up a research assistant position, I think at Rutgers University with Rachel Winfrey. Maybe it wasn't Rutgers, but Rachel Winfrey. And she's continued to work on bees ever since. So she went on to do a master's and a PhD at Northwestern University in conjunction with Chicago Botanic Garden. And for her master's, she got to look at green roofs in Chicago and look for bees nesting and visiting flowers on green roofs in parks and in prairies around Chicago. And then she did her PhD looking at habitat restoration of wild bee communities. And from there, she did a postdoc at St. Louis University, again, focusing on bee communities, but urban bee communities, their pollination services and their conservation in what was called the shrinking cities. And so Detroit, Michigan was one of her sites there where she looked at urban gardens and vacant lots. She is now an assistant professor at University of Michigan-Flint, where she's been since 2017. And she teaches courses in organismal biology, ecology, and plant-animal interactions. She has mentored a plethora of undergraduates for research. She's also served on graduate committees for graduate students and has some master's students now that she's supervising. She publishes not only in conservation biology, pollinator work, but also in science communication, plant love stories. That's an interesting one. And she's also devoted some of her time to writing and speaking about education and racial and social justice issues and combining those with her conservation work. So we're very pleased to have you with us tonight, Becky. And we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Welcome.
Thank you so much. And thank you for that. We at our house, we talk about having twinkles in our eyes sometimes. So I needed a second. Thank you. It was so incredibly kind. I am going to jump right in. Give me a moment to share my screen. It just takes me a second to show you only the part I want to show you. And then I have to make sure I can see all of you as well. Off we go. So the title I provided when asked to give this talk was talking about choosing plants for pollinators, which was almost true. And so this is choosing plants for pollinators with a focus on native bees. So first I'm going to introduce some of our players and talk about a couple other things we must consider for habitat for native bees in any lands that we manage, whether this is larger scale property or a restoration or a very tiny garden plot in an urbanized area. And then we'll get into the plant choices themselves. But we have to be able to recognize who we're trying to attract when they get there, so we know if we are successful. This is one of my favorite images, and I have some great resources at the end where I can share where some of these bee photos come from and some of my favorite books for identifying bees, no matter if you've never taken an entomology course or everything is a bug compared to, I still love this book myself, having done a lot of this over the past almost 20 years. So we have nearly 450 species of native bees in Michigan, in Michigan, which is astounding. Native bees worldwide, there are more species of bees than all of the mammals, all of the reptiles, and all of the amphibians combined. They're incredibly diverse. And there are a few different ways in which they live that may or may not be surprising. The majority of them are solitary. The majority of them do not have a social structure. So I'm going to introduce a couple very common species so you can look at the plants I'll recommend after they're in the ground and see if you're attracting any of those. So first we have the sweat bees. These are mostly soil nesters. They're typically smaller bees. So if you kind of look down at your pinky nail, like anywhere from the length to the width of your pinky nail is a pretty common size for these. Some of them are bright metallic green. Some of them are sort of a dull shimmery brown. Nearly all of these are solitary. So that means only the female has her own nest, even though it might have sort of an apartment-like entrance where everyone has their own house once you go in that main door. So that's where she will collect pollen and leave it for the eggs that she's laying for them to develop. Only the female has the nest, not the males. And only the female has pollen carrying structures. So she's the only one doing any work. Males mate and not much else. So for soil nesters, beyond the plants I'll talk about at the end that kind of apply across the board, we need bare patches of soil that are near potential foraging sites, so near floral resources. These smaller bees, they kind of, flying around football field sort of area would be pretty typical within a day. Some of our larger species will fly farther. A mile isn't unheard of, away from their nest. But bees are what we call central place foragers, is our science word for it. So if you imagine a circle with a point in the middle, the point in the middle is the nest, and she might fly out to collect pollen and come back, fly out to collect pollen, come back, fly out, collect pollen, come back. So she's kind of flying that football fieldish distance and back over and over and over again. Next up, another type of bee we may have already heard of, the leafcutter bees and mason bees. So these are in a family together, the Megachielidae. They have really large, chomping looking mandibles, which you can see very nicely in this bottom left picture. They're essentially their mouth parts with these little squiggly bits on them, and that helps the bees to be able to cut these little, almost looks like half moon circles out of leaves. So you will be able to tell if you have any of these leafcutter or mason bees in the cavities that they like to live in. Oh, I'll go back one more. They sort of line the edge, the interior of these little cavities in wood. I'll show you how to provide these in a second. It almost looks like there's a little wreath hanging on the door when someone's moved in. Some species, it'll look like it's plugged over with mud or soil, depending on the species of cavity nester. So for cavity nester nesting habitat, it's essentially the less work you do is better. So leave down some fallen branches or old firewood. Even in some of our native grasses like big blue stem, some of the little cavity nesters can hollow that out and they'll live inside. Abandoned burrows or abandoned rodent nests or kind of landscape piles are also typical places for these bees to move in. So essentially just resist the urge to remove things, little nooks and crannies, and especially if you're in a more city-like or a more urban setting, these types of things are really abundant, like little nooks and crannies in like brick mortar, perfect place for cavity nesting bees. I know I have one that's always outside my bedroom window that I should probably plug up like as a homeowner, but I can't because occasionally there'll be a bee who makes a nest in there and it just brings me joy to see her doing that. Anyone heard of bee condos before or have one of these or made one of these? I'm seeing some nodding. These can be helpful. I think for the most part, they're actually just a really great way to talk about bees with people because they kind of attract attention. You can spend as much money as you want on one of these, like on Etsy, and buy a miniature version of your own home, or you can go outside and drill some holes in a log, or just not pick up everything, and this will naturally happen. Especially those of us who live in a suburban or urban setting, the cavities aren't the things that the bees are really missing. So there are already plenty of places, but if you think they're cute, go ahead. I'm happy to talk about some maintenance things if anyone has questions about that later. From a research perspective, it's a very hot topic though. They're a little bit contentious because you may also be attracting things that like to eat bees and just giving them a buffet of a bunch of baby bees and straws for them to gobble up. Finally, our bumblebees, maybe 10 to 12 species in Michigan. I'm going to show you a different type of bee that looks kind of similar to this in the next slide. But for bumblebees, they're really fuzzy all over the place. They have a fuzzy abdomen as well. You can tell by the stripes on their abdomen which species they are. These need just bigger pre-existing cavities or actual holes. So a lot of bumblebee queens will move into abandoned rodent nests, and that's where she'll start. And notice I said queen there. Bumblebees really do have a social structure where there's a queen and workers, kind of similar to what I think maybe, I mean, I don't want to project, but maybe what a lot of us grew up thinking bees did when learning about honeybees as a child. And two more. We have the carpenter bees, which maybe some homeowners don't love. Has anyone ever had carpenter bee issues? So they actually prefer untreated wood. If you're able to leave some of that farther away from a structure that you don't want them nesting in, they will definitely go for that over treated wood or painted wood. The carpenter bee will excavate the nest itself. Most of us just think of these really big ones that almost look like a bumblebee on steroids, and it has a shiny abdomen, not a fuzzy abdomen. They sort of make these perfect drill looking marks and burrow right in, and then they'll lay an egg, partition it off, lay an egg, partition it off, leaving a little bit of pollen behind for that larva to eat while it's developing. There's also some much smaller carpenter bees in a different genus. Same idea, the holes will be smaller. We tend to not notice these. And finally, before we shift to plants, I can't not mention the kleptoparasitic species. If we're a birder versus somebody who studies bees, I don't know why we use C's for bees and a K for birds, I'm not sure, but it's similar to a cuckoo bird, where a cuckoo bee, the female will lay her eggs in someone else's nest. They develop faster, they eat the pollen, sometimes they even destroy the other larva, but it's because that cuckoo bee, the female, she has no way to collect pollen on her body. So she has to lay her egg in the nest of someone who's already done that work. Otherwise, her eggs and larvae won't survive. So these are just a few of the bees that you may be supporting and attracting by making some of these planting choices that I'm going to walk through next. And I'll share some resources also at the end about some of my favorite books and guides when we're trying to figure out what bees we're actually looking at in our yards. So let's switch to plants. Approximately, even 88%, it seems kind of, let's say 90%, approximately 90% of flowering plants are animal pollinated. And I think it's pretty common for most of us to first think about bees as pollinators, but it's not only bees that are pollinators. And the flower is sort of advertising to its specific pollinator because it wants that pollinator to visit it and then visit another flower of the same species to move that pollen around and help the flower get pollen to the next one, to the next one, to the next one, so that plant can create more seeds or more fruits, whatever it may be. So looking at these flowers, they look really different depending on sort of who they're trying to advertise for. So today, with our focus on native bees, I'm going to introduce a couple different, we call these pollination syndromes. If you're interested in supporting other types of pollinators, these are the types of plants to go for before we narrow down on plants that bees love, with some specific recommendations of species depending on your situation. So you might, oh, no audio? Is everyone else able to hear? Could I get a nod or a thumbs up? Are we doing okay? Okay. So first we have bat pollinated flowers. You can imagine bat pollinated flowers have a very strong odor. That is how they're attracting these bats at night who don't have the best vision. They're attracted to the odor. It's a big bowl shape, and you can see all of this pollen being displayed here. And that is so this bat, when it is open at night, can just totally face plant right into it and get pollen all over its face before visiting the next one. So these tend to be white, green, strong fruity odor, bowl shaped, and abundant, somewhat hidden nectar. We have some fantastic fly pollinated species here in Michigan. One of them, skunk cabbage, is completely disgusting and smells horrible, but is one of my favorite plants because it means spring is coming. So these fly pollinated flowers tend to look and smell like things flies like, which means rotting dead meat. They can have a putrid odor, a shallow funnel trap-like shape, so the fly goes in and gets stuck. They normally don't have nectar because they are just tricking these flies. The flies are visiting it, thinking it is something else. This is another one of my favorites, Titan arum. It's very similar to skunk cabbage, but if I were standing next to this one giant flower, my head would maybe reach about here. So you can just imagine what this greenhouse smells like when Titan arum is in bloom. It's really gross. Hummingbird pollinated flowers tend to be beautiful, scarlets, oranges, maybe whites. They do not have a ton of scent, but they do have a strong place potentially to land bird pollinated flowers in general. You can see these tubular long flowers, so the bird can fit its beak in and extend out its tongue. Things like cardinal flower and Indian paintbrush are great examples. We just have a giant patch of milkweed here for our butterfly pollinated flowers. There needs to be a nice spot for the butterfly to land, a faint, fresh odor. Bees also tend to go to these. Bee pollinated flowers make up over 80% of these flowering plants. They tend to be bright whites, yellows, blues, which purple. There's not a true blue flower. And they have something called UV guides, which I will show you in a moment what that looks like. They tend to have a fresh, mild scent, but there is something there to it. There's either a place to land, like on this sunflower, or something to crawl into, like with this penstemon, and that way the bee gets pollen all over it as it's foraging for nectar and also trying to collect some pollen for those females to bring back. These tend to be open during the day. They tend to have nectar. And these nectar guides I previously mentioned are on many of our native plants. So something really spectacular about bees, their vision is shifted into the UV spectrum. So they actually can't see the color red, but they can see beyond the blues and indigos and into UV all the time. So what our native bees can see is kind of what we see, like looking underneath a black light. A lot of our native plants have these called nectar guides. So here is an image of Rudbeckia, a black-eyed Susan. And when we look at this as though a bee could see it, you can tell exactly where the flower is advertising those pollen and nectar resources. There are some plant species that even after the plant is no longer has receptive stigmas, so there's the pollen, it won't do any good anymore, it's not releasing any pollen, it's done. Those nectar guides can even fade away. So individual flowers on the plant are advertising, oh, come to this one, that one's already over, come to this one. It's incredibly cool, and a lot of our native species have that. And I keep saying native plant species. I'm going to introduce this idea here and then show you something a little bit later, so you'll believe me that it's fresh off the press for one of the projects I'm working on. But that when we're trying to plant these foraging resources for native pollinators, you just need something available, especially very early spring all the way through fall. And I always use for fall as sort of an indicator of when it's time. You try to keep something blooming in your yard or on that land you're managing through the time when goldenrod is in bloom. Goldenrod's one of those very last things we have. You want to have something blooming, even if it is goldenrod. Bees love goldenrod. But goldenrod doesn't work everywhere. Some people don't like how it looks, and that's another big part of what we'll get into today. So bees prefer native plants. They'll visit them if given a choice significantly more than they'll visit exotic plants. A lot of our exotic plants tending to be things like our lawn weeds. We have some types of bees that require specific types of pollen and will visit certain things purposefully. So in Michigan, if you're trying to support some of our most, I would say the ones that tend to be most rare, these sort of specialist species, having native sunflowers and having Monarda, which is bee balm, those two plants will be really wonderful. There are a few species that are only visiting those for pollen that they're collecting, and having those two will really support some of the specialist bees in our region. I'm happy to share this file later. It might be easier to see than looking on a screen, but a huge consideration in trying to get these spring through early summer plants, things that are different colors and greater diversity overall. No matter the habitat I have ever been working in, whether it be green roofs or city parks, restored prairies, lawns, it's plant foraging opportunities. So the diversity of plants, it's a plant abundance and how many species. Looking at your diversity of plants, when you have greater blooming plant diversity, you'll have greater bee diversity at a site. This is one of the easiest ways we can support these visitors. In spring and early summer, a lot of the very earliest things we can do, believe it or not, are actually some tree pollen. So things like willow pollen, especially, even though the plant doesn't look like a bee pollinated flower, it's pollen that's available extremely early. Some of our flowering trees like crabapple or redbud, you'll notice those in the spring are absolutely teeming with bees. Part of this is because there's nothing else in bloom, and there's some considerations here too with the temperature being warmer and warmer earlier and earlier. So a lot of our plants are responding not just to temperature, but how much light is there during the day. So trying to make sure there's something available as soon as you start seeing insects flying around can make a huge difference, especially those early spring times. In midsummer, again, here's some more. We shift over into mid to late summer, especially rudbeckias and sunflowers. And again, I'll share this. I think it'll be more helpful later at home to look through and see what will be useful. I'm going to share some additional resources here for what to choose, but then talk about how to choose what to choose, which I actually think is really the most difficult part of the equation. Here is, I'm going to put this link in the chat, a wonderful resource from Michigan State Extension looking at native flowering plants that attract beneficial bees. So you can see here across the different months as to when their peak bloom time is, how the range at which they're going to be blooming, and then if they are very good, better, or best at attracting bees, and then some natural enemies, so additional beneficial insects beyond bees and pollinators. So I've placed the link to that free resource in the chat. And then there's one more version here. And here is this link as well. I think that one worked. I'll double check it at the end. You can also make these decisions based on the types of soil that you have. And so trying to have plants that are going to actually be successful, because these cost money, and the way that you're going to choose to do it completely depends on the scale at which you're working. And there's a big sort of context as to where are you planting them, as well as to what would be successful. What are your neighbors going to like? Is it going to be considered a garden or a problem, or how do you talk about things? So here are some suggestions for clay soil or moist soil or sandy soil. And I'll double check this link at the end to make sure that you're able to see this. And then finally, some examples of garden plants. And these are from Xerces Society, which is a fantastic invertebrate conservation organization at xerces.org. Some plants that a lot of people have in more formal gardens or in food gardens that are also very attractive to native bees. So here we have an example of creeping thyme. If you let your oregano or rosemary, sage, or basil allow them to go to flower, these are great resources to bring native bees in if you have like a little kitchen garden someplace in your yard. And as you're choosing to plant, thank you, I'll share the link. I think that one was broken, the pollinator native plant, so I'll double check my spelling on that. When we're deciding how to plant these, there are a lot of, again, sort of adorable resources about how to do this. This is planning your garden, think like a pollinator. Here's one more. Golly, I'm not sure why, I'll get all of these to you. So Anne, I'm going to use you as a resource, and I'm going to send you the handouts with all of the links that are functional, and I will stop sending out dead links in the chat. I apologize. These are some great resources. So being patient, giving time for native plants to grow. If you're doing this from seed, it can take up to 3 years, 4 years for the plants that you have thrown, like the species that you really expect to be seeing, to really mature into the space. So being patient, chemical free, putting it in a sunny place, large showy flowers, some of those species that are easier to see on the list than me naming off a bunch of names. This kind of is helpful, but this is not reality, I don't think. Like this is adorable, but not everyone can do this in their garden or in their space, or especially if you have acres and acres. This isn't a choice that we can make to make something that looks like this. And essentially planting these sites is really a balance of cost. It's a balance of your time, and time is a cost, and how much time do you have to maintain it, and aesthetics. And so I sort of see this on a spectrum of two very different, like it's the same idea with very different approaches, where it's either something like this image on the left, where it needs to breed as a very formal garden that just happens to be native plants, that is wonderful for native pollinators, to if you have a larger area, or maybe kind of something you can get away with in the backyard, but not in the front yard, can look a little bit more like a restoration and treating it like a larger scale project. So if you have a site that's a little bit smaller, or maybe you're making some front yard decisions, you can plant larger plants for immediate blooming rewards. For whatever reason, humans really like the number 3 when we see it, and it looks orderly and it looks like a pattern. And so especially planting these plants in groups of 3. So maybe there are 3 spiderwort and 3 rudbeckia, and then 3 more spiderwort. You can plant them in these clusters of single species groups. The bees are actually more attracted to them in that way. They're attracted to these sort of naturally patchy groups of flowers. That's how it would look in a prairie or in a meadow. The plant would be spreading underground, so the roots would be sending up new shoots. The plant would be flopping over and the seed would germinate right in that spot. So that sort of naturally patchy landscape is really normal for a bee. They tend to be better attracted to these denser floral arrangements, but you can make it read like a more formal garden in that way if you're in a space that it needs to appear like a more formal garden. Doing a little bit of weeding as maintenance, and then maybe a late winter cleanup if you have to, something like mowing it at the very end, or just cutting things down late winter. I do this in my front yard in one place, but not in another. I let those go. But you can save the seed and reuse it and let that space continue to sort of flourish year after year. If you have a larger area where you're kind of allowed to let things go a little bit, there's actually a really funny paper talking about how a lot of people's yards, we can maintain them like a mullet. So business in the front, party in the back, and the backyard can look a little bit more wild. So if you are able to do something like that, I recommend prepping the site, maybe using an herbicide if you are trying to decide away from a lawn or a patch where you're getting rid of lawn. You could apply something to kill the grass or put a tarp down over the whole summer and let the sun bake it so it goes away. Whatever you do, save yourself the heartache. Do not till that ground. You're just going to release a whole bunch of seeds that have been laying dormant of weeds that you do not want. Something you can consider if you're using seed on a larger area, put in a cover crop the first year. So that means something like an annual native plant. So like oats is commonly used for this. There's a little short native oat you can use. It'll just help you hold the ground so you're not fighting over so many weeds while the native plants you're waiting for come up. And after 3 to 5 years, you see a really big shift in that blooming community. Part of why I mention this sort of spectrum is there are really different things that people are able to, I'm going to say, get away with for native pollinator habitat. And a lot of it depends on where you live in ways that are underlyingly quite unfair. These are some images I took while walking around my sister's neighborhood in Minneapolis a couple summers ago. And maybe we've all seen some really beautiful front yard plantings like this where the native plants can spill over onto the sidewalk a little bit, the signs that it's sort of a bee safe yard. And, it kind of gives these signals that, you're hip with it. You understand how to do some native landscaping stuff. Maybe you like to go to the farmer's market, you listen to NPR, kind of a signal sort of thing. And this works if you're able to spend a ton of money on all of these big plants and things look great off the bat. But when you try to do this in a different neighborhood, like this example from St. Louis, you can be fined for weeds. And so depending on the situation, not all gardens can be considered the same. And just because these look really, really similar to me, the ways in which the plant is spilling over, there's clusters of native plants. And in different cities, these citations, this is an example from Chicago. Someone just trying to allow some native plants with flowers to come up was fined in this image. Of course, the image the paper takes is like the worst possible angle you could do. Over $10 million in assessed fines for uncut weeds in certain lawns. This is one of the things I've been working on in Flint with our research called the Porch Project. It's a project I'm working on with a community partner. Her name is Megan Haza. She is awesome. She's here. This is her son. He's in almost all of our pictures. You can kind of play Where's Waldo as we're going through a couple of these. And Megan's goal on the east side of Flint, where there's about a 50% vacancy rate of vacant lots, was just increasing neighborliness and activating front yard space. She wanted people out in the front yards more. And when we met and I heard about it, I asked if she had any money for landscaping. And plants are really expensive, maybe some marigolds or something. So this is something in my line of research that I could apply for funding for. And so we worked together in different ways and planted these 2 different types of gardens, and neighbors could choose which ones they wanted. We had some native plant options and some typical front yard stuff that's non-native plants, things like hostas, lilies, mums, roses, things that we're really used to seeing in front yards. But we planted these native arrays. We included the things that I think are the most attractive. So here's the cheat sheet right now. They're pretty easy to keep alive as well. Black-eyed Susan, milkweed if you can find it. There's a version of creeping phlox you can get here in Michigan that works really nice as a ground cover. It's quite beautiful. Penstemon, Baptisia. So it's a gorgeous plant. It'll stay up all winter and fall, and we have these beautiful seed pods that are really nice in color. Cone flowers, monarda, and spiderwort. And we just planted them in front yards. This is what some of these started out looking as. With students, we would go transform the space, and that was enough. As we're doing it, even the bees are visiting as we are planting them. Each one of these you can see is a little different. For example, at this yard, a little girl really liked playing in the dirt, so we made her a sandbox as part of it. This is one of the resident preferred the non-native garden in a very like structured way, which is also totally fine. The non-native gardens didn't have as many pollinators visiting. The native garden design, the bees were literally visiting these plants as we're putting them in the ground. It was really exciting. We went back and visited those for the next 2 summers to do some observations. But this is maybe 1.5 feet wide and like 7 or 8 feet across. You don't need a big space. Just choose a couple of these favorites and sit without your shadow falling over it, because bees freak out, like they don't like the shadows. Just sit and look, and you'll be amazed at what's visiting, even with this just little bit of habitat enhancement. One of the things that I think, maybe I just think I see it a lot because I have my eyes peeled for it, but another research question I'm working on with a group of collaborators, including the very talented artist Liz Anna Kozik, who did all of these illustrations. This link will work. Let this link work. This link works. So here's a link to that project specifically. Liz studies the history of restoration and land use. And I think that, has anyone seen the, oh, protect the weeds, they're saving the bees approach before, or maybe leave the dandelions, especially in early spring? The bees will go to those, but only because we don't, it's in this sort of lawn and there's just a dandelion available. If we give them something better, maybe it'll be better. And that's the question that we're working on. This is I've got 1 minute for this last idea. I might go 1 minute over. So if you're considering something other than a lawn, this is something I am considering at my home. I have seen a few different versions of this, and if any of you have tried to explore this and tried to explore what to choose, I think this can be tough to navigate online. I've frequently seen using clover as an option for bees, like a micro clover lawn instead, or just, like I said, letting dandelions come up. And we're wondering, are they going to those because there's nothing else? Can we design this in a better way? So we have a couple replicates of this experiment at 2 different parks in Chicago for now, and we're expanding this over this season, where we're trying a few different lawn alternatives. And when we think about our traditional average lawn, we mow it every week, or someone mows it every week. They're often watered. In the Midwest, we don't seem to get the same transform your lawn sort of pressures than out west, where it tends to be based on not having enough water. Water isn't necessarily the limiting factor here, but if we think about how high our grass typically is, that's sort of 4 inches, the grass roots only go down those 4 inches as well. And so some of these native species have root systems that go down, I'm not exaggerating, beyond 10 feet, especially some of our native sunflowers. And so they can be really great with stormwater retention, which tends to be another thing we're thinking about in transformed spaces. Like if anyone's ever had a basement flooding issue, this could be helpful for you. Or if you tend to have a low-lying wet spot, this could be helpful for you. So we've sort of designed these different options. We have different things that look like grass. There's actually a native type of grass called buffalo grass. You can get the seed. It's not a pollinator resource, so I probably shouldn't mention it, but if you're in a space where it's like, this has to look like lawn based on these rules, and maybe just something a little bit better is better, buffalo grass you won't have to mow it as much, and you have a little bit deeper of a root system. It's really adorable. It's kind of like a greenish blue in color. There's a few fescue type groups. So fescues it looks really similar to a grass, but it's a little bit different. And then we designed these diverse treatments that have low growing flowering resources. Just wondering, could this be better than these non-native lawn weeds? And the next two slides, I apologize for. You're gonna see how small these figures are. This is fresh off the press, not published. I haven't presented this anywhere, but I just wanted to show something that I think is really encouraging, in that any little thing you do in your yard or on that land, any little change can make such a big difference. So it doesn't have, like, if you have to have a lawn, maybe just choosing a couple little plants that flower that you could sort of plug into that lawn, it's going to make a little bit of a difference. And better is better. We don't have to get, sometimes it's hard not to get stuck in making the perfect choice. I know you can't see this. I'm asking you to trust me. This is small. On this side of the spectrum, on the left, we have the types of treatments that are just weeds growing in normal grass. These are things like dandelion and clover. And once we get on the right side, starting right here with the one that has 2 bars, these are things that we planted on purpose, wondering if maybe this could be better. If we purposefully chose, how I mentioned, those flowers where there's something blooming all the time. We chose things that were specifically attractive to pollinators, specifically attractive to bees, using all that information I presented ahead. So are they bee pollinator syndrome, and what type of soil do we have? So you can make these exact same decisions based on, oh, the backyard for me is sandy and the front yard is more clay. So the same flowers aren't going to do well in both. So if we look at this first figure I'm showing, this is how many flowers I observed in each plot. The red are the weedy flowers, the flowers I didn't plant, those clover, those dandelion, and the sort of gold color, those are the flowers I planted, the things on purpose we planted for bees. And then we did pollinator observations. And look what the bees are visiting. There are way more of these weedy, clovery, dandelion, chicory kind of flowers that are just going to come up on their own. But when the bees have another choice within that sort of football field of a flight range, they choose the ones that are the native plants that have the pollination syndrome that's for them. So this is our first season of data. And I'm sharing this specifically because, like, if you plant even some native violets, those are pretty acceptable in a lawn. I think native violets tend to be a little more acceptable than something like a dandelion. Even just throwing out some native violet seed instead of just letting dandelions go, you're already doing something that could make a huge difference. You can go full restoration type choices, especially depending on the budget. And I mean like a financial budget and a time budget, because this also takes time and takes maintenance. But you don't have to go all the way to a prairie or a meadow in order to be doing something beneficial for native bees in your yard. Just a little bit better is a little bit better. Some of my very, very, very favorite resources for this. So on xerces.org, you'll find their book, Attracting Native Pollinators. And I actually have a photo credit in this book that I was quite proud of. One of my green roof sites from my master's thesis, I have a picture there. Essentially, it was just green roofs with more flowers, we'll have more bees. That was the big ticket coming out of it. And The Bees in Your Backyard, that was the book that I'd initially mentioned that I think is something everyone loves. I like looking at it. My kids like looking at it. My parents like looking at it. They're, you're able to flip through, especially if you think you saw something visiting, you snap a quick picture on your phone, you're trying to figure out who it is. I think this is the most helpful book, and the pictures, the photography is just astounding. It's absolutely beautiful. 100 plants to feed the bees is another one through Xerces Society. And as I mentioned, and I saw Ann post in the chat, that we'll share the list resources as to where to find which plant. A lot of these, if I list everything, it's going to be different based on your sunlight and your soil type. So instead I'll list those out. And I told you my very favorite ones. Those are the ones we used for the Porch Project. I'm happy to list those again too. The Xerces Society has a pollinator conservation handbook, which outlines a lot of these. So we can provide, there's essentially 3 things bees need. They need nesting resources, which, as we went over in the beginning, nesting resources means you do less work. Don't put mulch everywhere. Don't till everywhere. Leave some bare soil, leave some dead sticks, leave some nooks and crannies. They need these foraging resources. So any little bit you can do in the space that you manage on whatever budget works for you, still better is better. And then they need a mate within flight range, which you can't provide. But if you do the first 2, hopefully everything they need will show up. If you really enjoy tracking and you notice that you like taking pictures of these and seeing, paying attention when you have your flowers out to see what's visiting, there's a wonderful sort of community science project, the Great Sunflower Project. You can find it at greatsunflower.org. And you can sign up. There we go. My goodness, me and these links. I'm going to jot all these down at the end here. You need Sunflower Project that's updated too. You can sign up and you'll get a plant, and then you just observe, and you're helping researchers look at differences in when do things start blooming versus when do we start seeing bees, which is a really important question, especially in the face of climate change. And so with that, I've definitely, I think, hit officially my 45. Thank you. So I'd like to thank the funding sources. And what I actually want to do is go through, I saw some great questions coming up. So let me swing back. And I will, which slide do I want to leave this on? I'll stop the share, but I'll show it back up in a minute if we have a question where it's helpful. Does that make the most sense? Okay. Let me make sure I can see everyone. So the first one I'm seeing pop up is looking at deer and rabbits. I have the same issues. So the plants that deer and rabbits are tough. They eat a lot of things. I've had good luck with milkweed, especially with swamp milkweed. So milkweeds have sort of that like a milky sap inside, and that's what especially like the monarch caterpillars, that's what they're feeding on, and it's that sap that actually makes it so they are like poisonous. But I think that also deters a lot of herbivore species. So I've had really great luck with milkweed. My backyard, truthfully, it is a wildlife corridor. I back up to, it's like one of those preserved wetlands around a subdivision where it's not really a wetland anymore at all. Like you wouldn't see it and think it was one, but it's sort of a natural area. We have a 100-acre nature center at the end of my road, and then our neighborhood surrounds a 100-acre park. We have so many deer that it's hard to, it's normal to see 6 in the backyard, and I still get milkweed in bloom. The things that I lost, don't spend money on phlox. Those got eaten. They were, the tall phlox got eaten pretty quickly. The creeping phlox, they don't seem to like. My echinacea are still doing really well in the front yard, and my baptisia are still doing really well in the front yard. And I know they go up there too, but definitely the tall phlox, those were, gone the year I put them in. That was I guess I fed someone. Probably shouldn't call it a waste of money, but it's not what I was going for. I wasn't feeding the group of animals I was going for as I was targeting. So I had luck with a few of those. A north-facing one that's heavily shaded. Oh, under the maple, we have a lot. Oh, dry and shady. I have some wet, shady spaces that are a little bit easier. And we've been sharing some images of some of these shady, what was it that we were just talking about that did really well? I want to say maybe Jacob's Ladder. There is let me mix these two together in my mind. Who else was back in that spot? It was dry and shady. I've had really good luck with native violets. You can order them as seed and just sort of scatter them around. It'll form kind of a nice carpet. They're happier where there's more sun, but they are doing really well underneath my crabapple that's quite shady. And I've had a really hard time even just getting grass to grow in underneath it at all. So any place that I've been slowly removing, whomever first did the landscaping at my house, whenever this was in the 80s, really loved hostas. It's like a hosta botanic garden. And I have people who I know like them. So I'm not completely getting rid of them, but the ones that I keep taking out, that's something that the violets will kind of hold the ground, especially if I don't know what I want to do. And I prefer it to the clover because the clover stretches and spreads really quickly. From an aesthetic perspective, I'm not sure how many of you are in a situation where the place where you're thinking this is controlled by, like, you could get a fine for some weedy type stuff. Some places have like an HOA, like a homeowners association, or maybe you're in charge of this at a different place where you manage a garden. So for example, in talking to like at a religious worship place, a religious worship or something like that, that it could read like you're not caring for it. And there's a whole science behind this. There's a thing called cues for care that you can do. So especially if you're trying to make some big lawn space transformations into a native garden design, mowing around the edges can be really helpful. Having some kind of border in between that mown edge. So like putting down a natural rock border, and then it will transition into a formally planted native garden. So you want to start low at the front and go higher and higher as you go back. Plant things in clusters, especially those groups of 3. I don't know why people are weird and we love patterns of 3. Like I mentioned, it just makes it read like it's purposeful. Those things can really help, especially if you're considering a lawn choice to make it not look weedy. I haven't been yelled at yet in my neighborhood, but also the person who lives across the street from me is a master gardener. So I might just be incredibly lucky. I'm not sure. Does anyone have any other questions at all? The small fenced in areas. Yeah, it depends. Again, where I'm not allowed a fence, where I'm managing, where I have choices to make in my very small lawn in a subdivision in sort of a city. But fencing in areas can really help, especially if you do little ones around some plants of concern that you're really interested in. The bees don't notice that at all if you have something that rabbits or deer can't get into. So there are these little deer exclosure type fences you can get, even a link. Rabbits can get through quite a bit of stuff, but you can do that if you have some plants you're really interested in keeping. What are the other ones we had some trouble? The native clovers, the prairie clovers. So that's one other one I've heard people like, oh, I don't want to do the white Dutch clover. I'll pick the native one. If you have issues with voles where you are, they really go after those. So you might have trouble keeping those alive. Phlox and dahlia. I always want to have them and I can't. We get gobbled up. Not sure if we have any additional questions. I'm happy to talk more about any given project or any site. I just know for me, when I'm trying to make my choices, it's okay, what am I picking? Oh yeah, please go ahead. Oh, a question about moss in the chat. Moss is awesome. I would never recommend removing it just because it's so cool. It can be slippery if it's like on a walk path or something like that. Moss, in a strange way, there are these spores. It's not something that is necessarily attractive to bees, but if you have a place that where you have moss that is happy, in the plant resources that we'll share back out, I would advocate you look for plants that are happy, that are wet and shaded. And if you have a really great like moss cover, you can plant little plugs, like just dig a little hole in the middle with like a bulb planter and put a little plant inside here, a plant inside there. But things that anything that likes wet and shade, and I wouldn't remove it. I think it's fantastic. I think moss is just so incredibly cool. It reminds me of like dinosaurs. I don't know. I think moss is great. It's not hurting anything. There are so many veggie crops that you could do that are attractive to bees. I'm guessing that was the question. Yes. So oh boy, where to start? There's an entire group of bees that just love squash family. So zucchini, cucumber, if you want to go for pumpkin or watermelon, like something you've got the real room for, any of the melons, there are these incredibly adorable bees that you will find in the morning sleeping in the flowers of those. They're the cucurbits, like they're just so incredibly cute. Especially those males, because they don't have a home. They sleep in flowers and underneath leaves. So anything along those, in that sort of general, melons, the tomato family, so tomatoes and peppers, and tomatoes do an incredibly cool thing. So the bees that visit them do something called buzz pollination. And so this like isn't something honeybees are good at all. Like this is something bumblebees can come and do. And the bumblebee is going to come up, and if you can picture a tomato flower, and maybe you can kind of, forgive me, I'm not an artist, right? But this is kind of what that flower will look like. And the bee is going to come and hang on right here. And what we can't see is there are these tiny holes in this part of the flower. And the bee is going to grab onto it, and it vibrates its flight muscles at a specific frequency, and it releases the pollen through these tiny holes. You can Google it. You can see it. Like you can do it with a Sonicare toothbrush. I've done this out in the field, actually with a student from Kalamazoo College, where we had to use a tuning fork to release the pollen to come out. I would always have tomato plants, not just because I'm Italian, but also because it's just so cool to watch the bees visit them and do this in these different ways. So blueberries will also, they'll have some buzz pollination for blueberries, but blueberry plants are just so hard to keep alive for me anyway. They like a really specific kind of soil. I feel like it's sandy and acidic. Though on the west side of the state, you're gonna have better luck than I will on the east side of the state. So maybe you will have a great blueberry time. Any fruit trees, these are all bee pollinated, anything you could think of. So apples, pears, apricots, any of these. And a lot of those are those early spring pollinating species that are going to be great resources early in the year. It tends to be when bees need it most. It's easier to find food in the middle of summer and more toward fall, but it's early spring that there tend to be the least resources available as our spring keeps kind of creeping up on them, because the bees are responding mostly to the temperature as their indicator to come out and be active, and then there's nothing to eat yet. Let me think, I'm probably missing a whole bunch of garden veggie stuff. Anything you love to eat that you're curious if it, or you love to grow that you're curious if it is like a bee thing. With anything that's like herby, you have to kind of let it go to flower. So I know with my basil, for someone who has a master's and a PhD technically in plant biology and conservation, I truly am terrible at like growing vegetable plants or house plant. Like I can do, if I throw seeds out and they'll stay alive, I can do that. I can do that part. But my basil, it tends to go to flower anyway, just because I'm not that great at paying attention to it. It might not start tasting as good. So once it starts to go kind of woody, I think it tends to be our inclination to just yank it and maybe go get another one. Leave it, just let it go. Oregano too, they'll still come visit that. And by them visiting those sort of herbs that you have that you've abandoned a little bit, they will visit the other things, like you'll be attracting them in. I'm a strong advocate for mixing. So mix your native plants in with your garden. And so it doesn't have to be this is here and that is there, especially with the garden, maybe when we're interested in the like deer and rabbit prevention of entry sort of thing. So maybe not as much putting vegetables anywhere you want, but definitely put native plants anywhere you want. And it'll make your veggies get visited more as well. Yeah, moss totally also will help with retaining moisture. It can absorb like a ridiculous amount of water. Mosses are amazing. I'm trying to see if I missed anything. Scrolling back. I'll get these links. I'm not sure, maybe it's the weird way I'm pasting it without the the beginning HTTP thing. So I'll share those back out. What I was starting to say, am I okay to talk for like another minute or two? I know, is that all right? I don't want to overstay my welcome.
Let's do 1 or 2 minutes and then we'll wrap.
Okay. So the thing that I just tend to get stuck on is like making sure I'm doing it. Am I doing it right? And I just want to, don't worry. Like any better choice you're making, it's going to be better than just grass or better than, you know, whatever. Like go. You can also pick what you like. Not everything in the yard or in that space has to be native, like, but try to do maybe a little bit more every year. Kind of better is better, and pick the things you like and things that'll work for you. And if you don't like it, don't worry about it. Like that's okay too. You're allowed to make the choices of things that make you happy on your property and in your garden. And I think that's pretty much it. Just also have fun with it, because it matters for you too. And for so many of us, especially these past 2 years, our gardens and our green spaces and our yards, like this is bringing joy, right? So just allow yourself and remind yourself to have fun with it too. And you'll see all the happy bees coming to visit with the changes. So that's what I got. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was a really informative and stimulating and interesting talk. Congratulations and thank you we look forward to seeing all of those links and resources that'll go on the COWO website. So that's it for this evening. I want to thank our speaker again. It was a great talk. I want to remind people that this is part of an ongoing series of meetings from Kalamazoo area wild ones. We have our native plant sale coming up on Saturday, June 18th from 10 to 3 at the People's Food Co-op. You can find more information on our website. And as we leave, I'm going to share information about our next meeting, which is on the once and future oak ecosystems. And that will be on Wednesday, February 23rd. So thanks everyone for joining us. Have a wonderful evening. And thanks again, Becky.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming.